Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to this Thursday, January 9th, 2025 meeting of the Finance Committee. Tonight we'll be following the published and posted agenda. Will be live broadcast by Chelmsford Telemedia and recorded for future viewing. Now that we've resolved, I think, partially our Zoom issues, we have no announcements this meeting, so the first item on the agenda will be the approval of minutes from September 26, 2024. Has everyone had an opportunity to review them?
Yes.
All right. Do I have a motion?
I make a motion to approve the Finance Committee minutes from September 26, 2024.
I second it.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
That's 5 in favor, unanimous for attendance. Next on our agenda this evening is a review and discussion of the special town meeting warrant Article 1, accessory dwelling unit zoning bylaw amendments. And with us this evening is Chris LaValle from the Planning Board. He's the Planning Board's Vice Chair. He's on night 3 of this week of giving this presentation, so we'll be gentle.
Thank you. I've had enough practice, so you don't need to take it easy on me.
Fair enough.
All right. So just to start off with some highlights of the Massachusetts ADU law. It was a law that was signed into law on August 6th, and it will take effect February 2nd. It's a state law that will apply to any municipality in the state, regardless of whether they have current accessory dwelling unit laws in the books or not. If there is a conflict between the local law and the state law and its guidance will take precedence over the local law. So our current LA limited accessory apartment bylaw, the LAA bylaw, will essentially be ineffective as of that date, if we don't take any action. And the state guidelines and the state regulations will take precedence. The stated goals from the state for this law is to essentially facilitate the housing stock growth. Their goal is between 8,000 to 10,000 new ADUs in about 5 years. And they're really prohibiting overly restricted regulations on ADUs. Their definition of overly restrictive includes owner occupancy requirements and a few others that I'll go over. Essentially, the law states that any protected ADUs, as they have defined them, must be allowed by right in any zones where single-family dwellings are allowed. Not just where single-family homes are single-family zones, but single-family or any zones where single-family units are allowed. And that essentially covers all of our residential zones. So highlights of the ADU law from the state. They have added this definition of an ADU. Jim, if you could go to the next slide.
Certainly.
They've added this definition of an ADU to the Dover Amendment protected uses, which limits the town's ability to create special permits for these. Attached and detached units must be allowed by right in any zoning district where single-family dwellings are allowed. They can be added as an accessory dwelling unit to any single-family or multifamily dwellings. It does, as I mentioned, limit the restrictions and the process that we apply to these accessory buildings. We cannot create limits on owner occupancy, age restriction, or affordability, very similar to the MBTA laws. And it allows us to apply limited parking restrictions. Essentially, we cannot require any more than one on-street or off-street parking space for any ADU, and any ADUs within a half a mile from a transit station, we cannot require any off-street parking. Their definition of a transit station includes any MBTA, regional and local ferry, subway, train, bus station, bus stop, or route. And if flagging is allowed at any place along that bus route, then that whole bus route is considered, by their definition, to be a transit station. So because the LRTA allows flagging along the entire route in Chelmsford, that means that entire route is considered a station, and any properties within a half mile of that cannot have an off-street parking requirement. And that comes out to roughly half of Chelmsford. So our planning board strategy and approach, we were following two essential objectives: ensuring that our bylaw is compliant and enforceable, while also providing clear standards and process for residents and town staff. One of the things to keep in mind with this is that the final regulations are still being drafted from the state. They expect the public comment period and the final regulations to end pretty soon, and the final regulations should be released somewhere around the first week of February. We don't know exactly when that's going to be, but essentially it probably won't give us enough time to react to any of those changes. So the approach that we're taking is to go based on their draft regulations that they've provided, their additional guidance that they've provided in a number of webcasts, and then base our initial pass at this to be based on those draft regulations. Once we get a little bit further down the line in implementing some of these ADUs, and we get those final regulations, we can then take further steps to amend or adjust these bylaws as needed. So essentially, this this rollout of the ADUs from the state is very similar to how they've rolled out the MBTA zoning, with some changes. They really learned a lot from that MBTA rollout. And so one of the things that I mentioned before is that essentially the state regs will take over, the state law will take over precedence as of February 2nd, which is a difference from the MBTA zoning that we encountered earlier. So really, if we don't take any action on this, we will have very minimal ability to control our own destiny on this. So key provisions of our proposed bylaw is that only ADUs as defined by the state will be allowed. According to the state guidelines, we could allow more of these protected ADUs if desired. Up to 2 may be allowed per property. The first one by right, the second one by special permit. We are taking the approach for this iteration that we don't want that second one in place yet. So we're only allowing one protected ADU in these bylaws. The size, the maximum size for the ADUs, protected ADUs by the state, are 900 square feet. The current size of LAAs in town is no more than 750 square feet. The gross floor area is measured somewhat differently by the state, so we're using their definition. Or it's the 900 square feet or 50% of the principal dwelling, whichever is smaller. As I mentioned already, the off-street parking space, we are requiring one for those properties that we can, but then anything within that half mile, we are not. The state also allows us to prohibit short-term rentals, which are less than 31 days, and we are. We are also not allowing new curb cuts for ADUs. They must use the existing driveway and walkway to branch off of.
Do you mean physical curb cuts, i.e. a curb where you have to cut the thing, or are you talking, like my street has no curbs?
So a curb cut is essentially a driveway entry into the street.
All right, so that you couldn't add a second driveway?
You could not.
Okay.
You would have to branch off of, it could branch very close to the street, but it would have to branch off of that initial driveway.
Okay.
The design standards that we have in place in this bylaw that we're proposing are the same ones as we have for prior entryways and stairs for any attached ADUs. And for detached ADUs, we are in the bylaw that we're putting in that it cannot be located within the front yard area and shall not have a height in excess of 20 feet or 2 stories or greater. And those are the same guidelines that we have in place, or same design standards that we have in place for detached structures in any single-family zone. The key provisions of this proposed bylaw for review and approval, on the next slide, is that for ADUs on single and two-family dwellings, the plan will be reviewed by the building commissioner. For any ADUs on multifamily, which includes 3 or more units, a minor site plan review will be required by the planning board. All setbacks and other dimensional requirements that we have in place already will still apply. And it mirrors the current process for zoning relief through the ZBA for any pre-existing non-conforming situations. The exception to this is that while the process is the same, the ZBA or the planning board or the ruling board cannot issue a special permit, which means it is not going to be a supermajority. It needs to be a simple majority, similar to what the planning board encountered fairly recently on the 150 North Road project, where it still came before us in a special permit process, but we weren't allowed to apply the supermajority special permit voting to it. If the property with the ADU proposed is non-conforming, the ADU must also not be substantially more detrimental to the existing non-conforming structure of the neighborhood. Other concerns that we have encountered quite frequently on this topic is sewer and septic. A lot of questions about that. So essentially, we've checked in with the DPW. We are not addressing any of these in the bylaw itself. These are going to be addressed by the DPW regulations. And they've said that the current regulations will remain mostly unchanged, but they do need to revise it to allow detached ADU connections to sewer. Right now, current regulations do not allow detached accessory units to be connected to sewer. Current regulations allow an increase of 500 gallons per day for residential properties doing any type of expansion. And based on Title V calculations, sewer increases for ADUs would be under that. So those would be covered by any allowable expansion for residential.
Chris, do you know, and have you been in contact with the water districts regarding whether or not they'll be putting a separate water meter on these?
There will be, I believe, separate water meters, but I think that's still being discussed.
Okay, because that would affect how sewer is calculated. All right, thank you.
Sewer connection design will be based essentially on best design standards and the topology of the property. So if the ADU is attached and next to the single family, then it would likely be branched, or at least in the same area. If it's a detached, it will depend on the topology of the property.
So Chris, since we're already maxed or close to max, there is a concern about maxing out in the sewer. Is there any, I mean, there's a lot of talk about this. I mean, what is the, there should be a concern about, and is there a cap on the ADUs that the town is looking at? So we're just going to allow people to build these and, you know, according to some person's calculations, it's under 500 gallons a day, but we're still even more now concerned about the maximum capacity in the sewer.
Yeah, from the bylaw perspective, we cannot cap it. From the planning board perspective, we cannot cap it. Paul may be able to answer a little bit more than I can, but in terms of the DPW discussions, based on their current regulations, they're allowing any residents to be able to expand under 500 gallons per day. And based on, I think, the state guidelines, that would still be allowed for any ADUs.
What if they went up, what if they 2X that or 3X that? I mean, is there any fee or any, you know, I know California does a similar thing where if you overuse your water budget, right?
Yeah, it's
it gets
unlikely
a
that
fee.
the addition of an ADU, especially since it's capped at 900 square feet,
Yeah.
would bring it over that.
No, true, okay.
But yeah, that if, in other cases that have come before the planning board, if the residential units do expand beyond the 500 gallons, there is an additional fee involved.
I guess my only concern is it doesn't sound like we're capping the number of people within this unit. Now, I know it's
Nope.
900 square feet, but,
Yeah, we're not allowed to actually
Yeah, cap it.
regulate that.
okay, thank you.
It'll essentially self-cap it,
Yeah,
the 900 square
Sure.
feet.
okay, thank you.
The next slide has essentially a quick comparison of our current LAA bylaws with the ADUs. The 900 to 750, right now we only allow attached. The new bylaw will allow detached and attached. No restrictions on who can occupy, and no restrictions on the ownership of the ADU or principal dwelling. Right now, we have either, that the principal dwelling must be owner occupied. The new ADU laws don't allow us to put that restriction on either unit. So the timeline, as you know, we had our planning board meeting last night, public hearing. We did close the public hearing and voted unanimously to move this forward as drafted. And I presented to the select board on Monday. They're expected to vote on it on the 27th, and then town meeting on the 27th. We will continue to monitor the state regulations as they are developed. We continue to work with town council on any new interpretations that might be coming out, what other towns are doing, things like that. And depending on what the changes are, we may be able to amend the bylaw at town meeting if it's within the scope of the original proposal. If not, then we'll certainly be readdressing it potentially for a spring town meeting or fall town meeting, depending on what the changes are.
What do you feel the percentage of completion is for the state's draft into final? You think the changes will be minor, significant, wildly different?
We don't know. My feeling is that given what they just encountered with the MBTA law, I think they're pretty complete. I don't think they're going to, they definitely won't relax them. They're pretty set on how strict these are. If anything, they may get more strict. Right now, we're unclear as to the interpretation of what we can impose on the restrictions. So, for example, there's some differing opinion between whether the regulations that we can impose are only specific to the single-family unit or anything on the single-family property. So, for example, the restrictions that we have for accessory buildings, we are applying those to the ADUs. Other people are interpreting that we shouldn't be allowed to do that, but our town council's opinion and the approach that we're taking is that those accessory buildings are part of that single-family dwelling, and so as such, we are applying those design standards to the ADU as well.
What is an accessory building?
A shed, a pool house, things like that.
Does an accessory building have to be powered in any way?
No.
Okay.
No.
So a shed, a
So-
garage,
Yeah, so we do have those restrictions on height, and they can't be put in the front yard in front of the house. We also have the curb cut restriction, things like that.
if you have, I'm just thinking like places in the Westlands and places in North Chelmsford, there's some fairly small lotted houses. would they still have to fit into all the zoning sideways, this much sideways kind of thing?
So, yes, however, if they don't, if the ADU, so if the single-family home is within setbacks and conforming, they want to put on an ADU that makes it essentially non-conforming, that would have to, based on town council's opinion right now, and this is what hopefully the final guidelines will give us, is they would have to go before the ZBA for zoning relief in terms of a process. But the voting would be quite different, and the standards that they apply would be quite different. So the process would be very similar, but it would end up being not as strict from the ZBA's perspective.
So so somebody trying to do an accessory building on a smaller lot would have a much harder time in the before times, but less hard in the after times.
Potentially, that's what the state's aiming for.
Okay.
But as town council mentioned last night, it might end up being case by case, depending on the characteristics of the property, the layout, how much out of compliance and out of,
Is there any percentage of land, like your house can't take, your house and your accessory buildings and your ADU can't take up more than 40% of the available land, lot size, anything like that?
there are floor to area ratios that we still apply, but again, those are not going to be as enforceable on ADUs.
So if you're got a lot and you're gonna build an individual house, there's all these rules. But if you have a house and you wanna put an ADU on it, the rules are a little, you can't put it in the front yard, got that one. But that's about the only thing I can.
Setbacks still apply,
Okay.
so the setbacks around the property are still going to apply. But if someone wants to put an ADU within that setback, currently, it would be very difficult to do that because they would have to go before the zoning board. The zoning board would have to, the landowner would have to show that there's some feature or characteristic of the property that doesn't allow them to do it anywhere else. With the ADU, they don't necessarily have to show that. And the voting threshold is going to be different. So I believe it's supermajority on the ZBA for those relief, granting
Supermajority,
relief.
2/3?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that for these cases, it would be a simple majority.
So if there's an existing non-conforming and someone goes to add an ADU, and it says non-conforming, it doesn't meet the setback requirements, it's not going to matter if it's still within the same footprint of the current building, theoretically?
There could potentially.
Yeah.
A lot of these questions, we
Will
don't.
be case by case, you don't know yet because they haven't finalized the.
They haven't finalized the regulations. They haven't given us any guidance on these specific types of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they don't, it might end up being a case by case
Sure.
at the zoning board level.
Yeah, so theoretically, someone that can't build an addition on their property because they lack the FAR could have an ADU instead.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you think the state will impose quotas, town by town? And what, I mean, you've done this 3 nights this week, and you've done your homework for sure. What's the general pulse of the town? Are they loving it? They can't wait to get into this? I mean, what's happening?
Some people love this because they've been trying to get an ADU type, an accessory dwelling on their property for a while and haven't been able to because of the restrictions we have.
Yeah.
Some people see this as another way of increasing the housing pool, which will bring down prices. There's a lot of disagreement on whether that actually will happen. Some people are opposed for this for various reasons, similar to the MBTA. It's the state imposing their will on us. Some people are just worried about the I myself am worried about the Dover Amendment
Yeah.
applicability on this.
I'm sorry, middle of the movie, Dover Amendment?
The protected use. So the state has, under zoning, uses that are protected under the Dover Amendment. It's now the ADUs, religious institutions, nonprofit education, and also daycare. And those essentially are exempt from most, if not all, local bylaw regulations.
So they can go anywhere.
So we have and this happened on North Road, the planning board has very little leeway in what we can require, what we can reject, and that brings the threshold of voting from the 2/3 vote down to the simple majority.
So this now, okay.
Chris, has there been, with the curb cut situation, I know that you have the regulation, you're saying that that you're not going to allow an additional curb cut. Has there been any thought as to how that's going to affect trash pickup? Because currently, with our trash pickup, it's based upon, I think, 36 gallons per household per week. And with that, the trash pickup bases it upon address and driveway, essentially. So if we're having a bunch of these ADUs put in that don't have an additional driveway, don't have additional curb cut, how are we going to?
They will have an additional address.
They will have additional address. So how are we going to make sure that the pickup knows that it's 2 separate addresses at that location?
There are a lot of unanswered questions like that we
Okay.
still have not. Yeah.
And part of the reason for not the curb cut is not, so we still
I get it.
maintain that.
It maintains the look and everything like that, but I'm just, logistically, I'm not sure how that's going to work. And that's definitely going to be a cost issue with the contract. Well,
Pick up, yeah.
yeah, I heard that. Transfer station, here we come. Okay. Any other questions for Chris?
I looked at a presentation, not by, you gave, but one that was done by the state, and it talked about you could match the height of the existing building, but you said 20 feet is the limit? Is that allowed in that whole?
So we think it is, because in one of those other slides, they had what you can and cannot apply to these ADUs. And so this was discussed last night. In the main body of the legislation, it specifies the single-family dwelling. However, in the subtext box from the state, they ask questions like, do you have regulations already for applying regulations to accessory buildings, like sheds and pool houses? And the implication is that if you already have those would, and if they're applied already to other accessory buildings, they would also be able to be applied to ADUs, is our interpretation.
Okay, so somebody who has a Victorian house, which would definitely be over 20 feet tall, they couldn't add like an addition in the back that matched the style because it would be over 20 feet tall.
So right now, with this bylaw, they would not. If we did not have that, they technically could, but they're also limited by the 900 square feet. So something that tall at 900 square feet would be an
Really skinny.
odd-looking tower.
Right, but again, if we don't do this, there'll be that one person
Yeah.
in town
Yeah.
that does that, and,
Mhm.
I'll be lucky enough to be living next door to them, right? Like, you don't
I
want to
hear
be
ya.
that person, right? Like, so,
It'd
So-
be interesting, maybe build a tower for your,
So what about,
Something else.
what about lots that are not even, that have hills in the back, say, for example, right? Where, even a one-story, 900 square foot dwelling would, from the street view, technically be taller than the, say, ranch in front of it, for example.
entirely possible, and based on what we've seen so far, we cannot regulate that.
So it's 20 feet from the ground that it's built on. Okay.
Okay.
All right, from the financial aspect portion of this, obviously, permits would need to be pulled to build these ADUs. Do we anticipate there'll be a rush on construction of these ADUs and an increase in permits that are being filed with the town?
We don't know.
You don't know, yeah.
So I suspect in the first year, maybe not a lot of activity, right? But over the next several years, perhaps. I mean, the state is looking for upwards of, 10,000 in the next 5 years, which sounds aggressive to me, but maybe not. I mean, how is this going to affect our infrastructure? We were just talking about trash. We just signed a 5-year agreement with Harvey. 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 ADUs isn't going to amount to a hill of beans, honestly, but 20 or 40 would, right? So, is the state providing any guidance on how we address those issues?
Nope.
Okay.
Nor are they providing any money for
Yeah,
that.
well, that's what I was politely asking.
You should know better than that.
No money, no guidance.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds about right.
Okay.
And maybe this is a question for the gentleman to my left, but as far as valuing these ADUs from a tax assessment perspective, do we have any kind of idea, has there been any discussion as to what we expect that might lead to as far as valuations and when those valuations would be done?
That's a very good question. You got a couple of things. First of all, it would increase, one benefit would be new growth. Okay, so it absolutely adds to the tax base, so that's a good thing. In terms of the actual valuation of the property, we haven't really given it much thought, but it would be, essentially, it would be a square footage calculation.
Okay.
So it would be a cost, the value from a cost perspective more than anything.
Sure. Because you're not increasing any land, you are
Exactly,
increasing
exactly
the value
right.
of structure. Okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
So just getting to the LLA, how many are in town and how many are permitted per year on average? This is kind of getting to your question on demand.
That came up last night. Trying to remember where I took that note. Nita, do you remember?
I was about to go look.
I think Nancy Arroway, when she spoke, she mentioned, I want to say 300,
I think that's vaguely what I recall from watching.
but I don't think we've done any research to validate that or
Okay.
not.
And over what period of time? Was it like 10 years, 20 years?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think that was total.
Yeah.
That's a total number, yeah,
Yeah.
since the LLA's been in effect.
Oh.
So, not many.
But the ZBA does get a significant number of requests for LAAs every meeting. I mean, I look at the ZBA agendas, and almost every meeting there's a request for 1 or 2.
And that's with more stringent restrictions at the
Yep.
time being. There are much less restrictions on this.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that we cannot regulate the use of that ADU or the ownership. So some people may want it as an in-law apartment. Some people may want it as a rental unit. Some people may want both units to be rental units. Some people may offer more of a condo association where both units are owned in a condo.
What about businesses? Can they run businesses out of, I mean, is there any regulation there? There's no regulation, but what? it
It's
can be used for.
residential only.
As long as it's legal, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
The limited accessory apartment bylaw was adopted in 2001.
There you go. So it's when it's 20 years, about 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, would accessory uses apply to this ADU? I think theoretically they would.
Theoretically, yeah.
Yeah. If we don't vote to adopt, please, I know what you're going to say, but what happens if we don't adopt?
If we don't adopt, as of February 2nd, our LAA bylaw essentially becomes null and void, and the state law becomes our default bylaw,
Okay. And at that point,
which is very open and very non-restrictive.
and even though we would be able to promulgate regulations that are in conjunction with that, it would be after the fact, and so anything filed before that would be
Yep.
subject to. Okay. right. Any other questions for Chris?
And so that's why we're taking the
That's why
approach
we're
of
taking
as
the
tight as we can legally first, and then loosen it up as we
Sure.
need to.
And does anyone expect someone to try to push the envelope that we're creating?
I do expect someone to push the envelope as soon as February 3rd, based on public comments.
Okay. Which comment so I can start watching that show?
There are a lot of comments on Facebook.
Oh, yes.
And last night's meeting.
Okay, seeing no other questions. Chris, thank you very much for coming for a third night to give this presentation.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. All right, next on our agenda, we have appear to public comment. Seeing none on the Zoom. Next on our agenda is a discussion of the special town meeting warrant article and a vote of recommendation on the same. All right. Do I have a motion?
I make a motion to recommend Article 1.
All right.
Second?
Discussion.
Do we have a choice?
We always have a choice.
Always have a choice. Milton
if we
Milton had a
vote-
choice,
yeah.
right? When they voted down the MBTA, we always have a choice.
And there is no penalty if we don't adopt it.
This is different
You're right.
because
You're right.
they didn't change their zoning, so there wasn't
that's
any,
true.
right, like, so they voted and they're gonna sue and whatever they sued and they're trying to figure out. This, if we don't vote for it, it defaults to the state, which is a lot worse. Like,
Exactly.
so,
It isn't
and that,
actually all done yet.
well, yeah, but it's a free fall, like there's no height restriction, there's, and someone, could find themselves next door to something they really didn't like, and at least we're being proactive on
Yeah.
this, so this is
Yeah.
a little bit different, not that
No,
we're
I
doing
understand.
anything.
I understand. I was just referring to
Yeah, yeah.
the choice
Yeah,
portion
no,
of
I
it.
mean, I'm like, I
more
don't think
than
anybody's
the
happy
details.
about
And,
this.
and
Right.
initially,
Oh, no, for sure.
initially, they're pursuing the most restrictive avenue they can, which may be tightened, loosened up later. But this is, in my opinion, the absolute correct approach for the protection of the town. So I'm in favor of it.
The best of a bad deal?
So ours would take precedence, so if somebody came up
Correct.
and didn't like, this proposal that we have, they couldn't throw the state's mandate at us, the state's guidance and say,
Correct.
oh, but the state said this.
Yeah,
Okay.
as Mr. LaValle explained, that's the interpretation of
Yeah.
our town council, but I think that's what we go
Okay,
with.
okay.
Yes.
Triple checking, thank you.
Yeah. It's a little bit different. There's no set penalty. The penalty is self-imposed if we don't adopt it.
So if you don't pick it, you get
We get what the
whatever
state gives us.
State decides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like if you don't check off that you want that special dinner, you get whatever's left over.
And it's left to the building commissioner to determine what reasonable regulation.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Exactly,
Could be subject to challenge.
exactly.
Certainly. So I think the choice is an obvious one.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
pretty straightforward.
Okay.
And when we go to town meeting, how do you answer the people who we should just say no? Because that's the part
Because it's different. It's not the same as the MBTA. It's not adopting and choosing a location for something to happen based upon regulations that are currently being challenged. Here, it's going into effect, and if we don't adopt the regulations, we get what the state gives us, and we're subject to doing what they tell us to do. They've given us the opportunity, at least initially, we'll see what the final regs say, to apply our own not completely restrictive, not non-restrictive, but not completely restrictive regulations in the bylaws, and that's what the planning board's doing here. They're saying, let's put in what we can. There's no set penalty for doing that. Like if we hadn't adopted the MBTA, there were the penalties that were associated with not adopting it by the certain timeline. The SJC decision came out and they said, well, you need to go back to the board and properly notify and address your regulations. But the people, basically giving it out for the people that didn't adopt them, saying, you're going to have to, but we're not going to apply the penalties that you were going to face had it just gone through automatically. So it's kind of a redo that the state gets to do to say, okay, we're still making this required, but the people that didn't adopt it when they're supposed to adopt it this first go-around have the opportunity to now adopt it because they're going to have to adopt it because there's a ruling that says that they have to adopt it, but they're not facing the penalties before. So different situation, different scenario. Here, if the regulations say, well, yours are too restrictive, the planning board will have to get back together and adjust it to be less restrictive. I guess theoretically, if they were allowed for more restrictive, which I don't think would happen,
No.
I mean,
You can't-
theoretically, go back and make more restricted regulations. Be great. It's not going to happen, but
Yeah, the part that the state part, I'm just confused, is like, why did it decided that you didn't have to be owner occupied, which I thought,
That was that a lot of, I can tell you, like Simon Cataldo, our rep,
yeah,
there was a lot of discussion about that. I think you actually spoke at the State House via,
Yes, I did.
about that. This was a big issue. I can tell you, from a lot of people, my perspective as well, neighboring towns, Lowell, more, that was the one thing that's like, all right, you want to put this in, you need to do it owner occupied. And I think people just didn't want to hear it. I also think, quite frankly, there's money behind this, private equity funds,
Sure.
money pushing this. They don't want that.
The legislature was lobbied,
Yep.
to Anita's point. That
Okay,
did
'cause it-
happen, yes.
yeah, because having lived down south for a while, there were neighborhoods that were all investor-owned homes, and they were meh neighborhoods.
Mhm.
So that's something I wish we could avoid, because that's not great.
Well,
I personally, as a finance person, I look at this and I'm like, I don't understand number-wise how this is going to help the housing market. Because I think this now brings more of incentive for investors to come in and outbid, the young couple who's trying to
Correct.
start
Yep.
out and
Yep.
buy their
yep.
starter home, because they can always outbid them. And so, I've told people who I can tell,
it'll be a rental economy.
yep, that's scary, and
We
that
were
scares
trying
me.
to
That is
avoid.
scary.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
It- Is there any scenario that the state can come back to us and say, oh, you're being too lenient, or, you need to fall more in line with this particular regulation? Is there any scenario where that could happen?
Well, yes, so they may make, they're still in the process of finalizing these regulations.
Yeah.
And not more lenient, more
I
restrictive.
guess that's concerning,
Yeah.
right?
And so, what that means is that we won't be able to apply that portion of the regulation, and the planning board will have to go back and make the adjustment to our regulations.
But wouldn't that be driven, wouldn't that have to be challenged by someone who's trying to develop something? Wouldn't they have
Yeah.
to kind of initiate all of that? I don't know.
I don't know, unless the state,
Not
is the
because
state going
because the
through
state
a,
hasn't finalized it.
are they going through a random review process of towns' proposals and?
Well, they are taking input from towns and public right now.
Yeah.
But they've also learned some lessons from the MBTA process.
Yeah,
So they could say, for example, the accessory units, they could go back and say, you can't apply those accessory building design standards to an ADU. They could come back and say that. That was the argument last night in public comment. Town council's opinion is this is our interpretation. The public speaker may be right. Town council may be right. We don't know yet. Those are two varying opinions.
Yep.
The final regulations may resolve it one way or the other, or it may not.
oh, they may not.
And if they don't, that's where it becomes a challenge,
Yeah.
that someone tries to do something, and it becomes a legal battle at that point.
But they would have to initiate that.
But they would have to initiate that.
But what will happen before that is, after town meeting adopts the bylaw, it goes to the Attorney General for regulatory
And they will have to
approval.
review
And
it.
they'll have to make a ruling. Now, they could strike provisions of the bylaw.
They could.
And we've seen that in the past, and then it will go into effect. But, so that's what's gonna happen. So it's not only what may come out of the final regulations, but every community, in case of cities and towns only, not cities, but towns, our bylaws will be sent by the clerk's office to the Attorney General's office. They'll have 90 days to review it and then make a determination. So that's the other check that
True.
we'll have right up front.
Any further discussion?
Nope.
All right. We're going to do a roll call vote on this because David is on the Zoom. David, if you can unmute, please.
If you insist.
Thank you. So hearing none, I'm going to call the vote. David?
I'm in favor.
Okay. Sam?
Aye.
Stephen?
Aye.
Anita?
Aye.
Cindy?
Aye.
Elaine?
Reluctant aye.
And I'm also an aye, so that's unanimous in favor. All right, thank you. Any additional public comment? Seeing none. Discussion of special town meeting warrant article and vote recommend, oh, we did that. Discussion of timeline for finance committee warrant book production. So we have to basically have, it's warrant book. So we have to, it has to have all the information. It'll be a pamphlet probably, Pam, right?
I assume so. I
Yeah.
don't, someone needs to email it to me. I don't actually have the document,
Uh-huh.
so I just.
I will
need-
send that to you.
I need to clean it up slightly.
Okay.
But
What-
yeah, I can get that to you guys.
Yeah, and I don't have the warrant either. The-
Yeah.
Okay, the warrant, so, okay, I just need the warrant. I have the vote.
Do you want the slides in the booklet as well?
I mean, they aren't a ton of them. I could put them into the booklet.
Might as well because there's nothing else in it.
There's nothing else in it, yeah.
I can send those this weekend.
That'd be perfect. What we have to do is get it off to the printer by Monday.
Okay.
In order to be compliant with it's funny, our bylaws require a 2-week production for special town meeting, a 1-week for regular town meeting. So, I know, don't ask me, I don't know.
So when is this needed?
Monday,
This coming Monday?
this Monday, yes.
All right, and how are we printing it? Am I emailing it to Tricia, or what are we doing?
That was my next question.
Chairman, I was just going to make a suggestion. Because of the length of it, we may be able to print it here on copy or at town
Okay.
offices just to save on printing rather than having it professionally printed.
Okay.
Okay, and so who do I email it to?
You can email it to me if you'd like.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so we'll put together it'll be a quick letter.
Yep.
The regular voting procedures and everything like that. I'll check in with John. He said he may have had a comment on one of the voting procedure issues.
He actually emailed me a redo of the back section.
Did he?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll include that as opposed to the previous ones that we've used. And then we'll get it over to the town Monday. Be a fun weekend. All right, that'll be the fastest production of a book we've ever had, though, I think. We'll see.
Record time.
All right, discussion of timeline for the production, we've just done that. Discussion of future meetings, so your budget will be finalized pretty soon, Paul, correct? End of January?
Yeah, I think it's because of the town meeting, it's gonna probably get pushed back to.
Oh,
February
true.
3rd, February 3rd.
Okay. So likely mid-February for our first meeting. And then we'll go from there. We'll start in earnest, have our first meeting, do all our appointments, check all our appointments, and then start our reviews so we can get going and get our departments in and our recommendations together. Any
So it would be a Thursday, it would likely be the 13th or the
dear.
20th?
let me see. One of those two. And the reason why we want to have that initial one is because that starts the process for making those meetings so we can have people come in and give their presentations. We don't want to wait too long because then we run out of time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'll be presenting it to the select board on the 3rd. I can come anytime after that to present.
Oh, so I guess we could do it the 6th. We could start the 6th and then maybe not have another meeting until the 20th or the 27th based upon when people are able to meet with their respective departments. And there are no
citizens.
citizen petitions? All right, perfect. Okay. I took public comment out of order. Any further public comment? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? No? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, David.
Boy, Dave.